Aquaba. Welcome to You Ain't Imagining This. I'm Amma Robin, your sister host here in YAIT Town. Today, I'm sitting in Umoja Café with a cup of tea. That's right, I know. Usually, I'm an espresso gal, but today's conversation and reflection, I think, required tea. I'm actually thinking out loud about something that I've been noticing. Let me ask you this. Have you ever felt invisible in a space where you knew you belonged? Have you ever wondered if you really even mattered there? Well, I will say yes, I have asked myself those questions, and I'll say yes to answer both of those questions. Then, I realized that I definitely belonged there, and yes, I absolutely mattered there too. But the struggle against being or feeling invisible is real. I felt invisible in some spaces, and I think the struggle against invisibility, especially for Black folks, is absolutely real. And sometimes invisibility does not look like disappearance. Sometimes it shows up in plain sight. Because it's Women's History Month, this reflection feels especially relevant. For generations, women, especially Black women, have often been present in the room, shaping communities, carrying families, building movements, and somehow still being made to feel invisible. Not erased completely, but invisibilized. Don't you love that word? Our voices have been softened. Our leadership has been minimized. Our contributions pushed to the margins. But this experience is not limited to Black women alone. Black men know this too. Black children feel it. That's kind of sad. Entire communities have lived it, and that's tragic. Being present, but not fully seen. Being visible, but not fully valued. Lately, I have been noticing many ways that invisibility shows up in everyday life. That's right, on a daily basis, personally, culturally, and structurally. Once I started seeing it, I began writing those moments down. I didn't write down explanations. I just wrote down my observations. And before long, the list was long, longer than I expected. If this reflection resonates with you, please feel free to like, share, or leave a comment. That would really help other people to find this discussion, and it would help me to know, how you sat with it and what it meant to you. You might also want to share this episode with someone in your life, a friend, a sister, a colleague, or another woman who may have experienced some of these same moments too. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can offer each other is language, a way to name something we have felt but could not quite explain. For many people, that word may be invisibilization. Big word, invisibilization. The experience of being present, capable, even visible, and still somehow not fully seen or valued. Once something has a name, it becomes easier to recognize. So today, sitting here at Umoja Café with my cup of tea, I want to share some of the ways invisibility appears in plain sight, at least from what I've seen, no pun intended. Some of these things may feel familiar. Some may feel uncomfortable. And some may feel like something you've always known but never quite had words for. But there's something important I've also come to understand. Being invisibilized is not the end of our story. The answer to invisibility, the opposite of invisibility, is mattering. To matter. So just listen. Notice what resonates, take what you need, and leave the rest. Once I did start paying attention, something interesting happened. I really did begin noticing moments of invisibility everywhere. In small interactions, in conversations, in meetings, in the stories we tell about our communities. And before long, after writing those moments down, my list, as I said, was long. Because there were so many on the list, I decided to shave it down to some core experiences. But first, I do want to share an experience that I had. And this moment has stayed with me for a long time until I've had the name for it. So one day, I was sitting in a meeting sharing an idea that I've been thinking about for days. This was an important meeting, and I was really wanting to be prepared, and I wanted to share this. I explained it carefully. I thought. I made my point, and then I waited. The room was quiet. There were no questions, no responses. The conversation simply moved on. Yes, that was awkward, and I thought, what just happened here? But I waited. About 10 minutes later, someone else said almost the exact same thing, and you can guess who that someone else was. But suddenly, the room lit up. People leaned in, people nodded, people said, "That's a great idea." Wow, wow, wow. I didn't even know what to say about that, so I didn't say anything. But I can tell you, I've carried that moment with me for a long time. And yes, it was dramatic, but mostly it just felt familiar. It was like, oh, this again. And once I started paying attention, I began to see moments like that everywhere, in different meetings and in conversations, as I said, in the news, in stories we tell about history. And that's actually what prompted me to start writing these down. And these I consider to be the many ways that invisibility shows up right in plain sight. Because honestly, I think the rest of the people at the meeting didn't see it. It was invisible to them, even though they were right there. But I can tell you, I saw it, I felt it, and I remembered it. So it was in plain sight. Let's get to the list. And I want to tell you too, at the end of this list I want to think of a unique form of invisibility that many people don't recognize at all. I call this, and this is hard to say, but it fits, invidious invisibility. You got to stay with me to hear these experiences at the end. There are 3, and they're often mistaken for something positive. So people don't even see them, first of all, and they certainly don't see them as being invisible. I'll come back to that near at the end. Let's get started with this list. Invisibility in plain sight. When you share an idea in a meeting and the room moves on without responding, then 10 minutes later, someone else repeats the same idea and suddenly people say it's brilliant. When you're sitting at a table, participating in the conversation, but you notice people responding to everyone else and skipping over you. When someone speaks over you and the group continues as if you hadn't started speaking at all. When people ask for your opinion, but the decision has already been made before you even answer. When you watch a news story about your community and realize that no one from that community was even interviewed. When a story describes what happened, counts the damage, lists the statistics, but never names the people whose lives were affected. When a history lesson mentions a major movement, but the Black women who organized, strategized, and carried the work are barely even mentioned. When people talk about diversity and inclusion, but the leadership table still looks the same, and I mean white. When you attend an event celebrating your culture, but the people whose culture is being celebrated aren't part of the planning or the leadership. When your experience is questioned until someone else repeats it and suddenly it becomes credible and believable. When people treat your perspective as personal opinion instead of lived knowledge. When someone assumes you must be angry or emotional when you're simply speaking directly. When people say, we're all the same, in a way that avoids acknowledging what you actually experience. When you notice your community being discussed as a problem that needs to be fixed, rather than a group of people with knowledge and experience and leadership. When policies affecting your life are created in rooms where no one like you is present. When organizations show images of diversity in their brochures and websites, but those same faces are not part of the real decision making. When you hear a story about innovation or progress and later discover that the Black person who led the work was barely even acknowledged. When you see headlines about violence or crisis in Black communities, but very few stories about everyday life, creativity, leadership, success, or joy. When someone studies your culture, your music, your language, your style, but shows little interest in the people who created it, or even you. When you realize that sometimes you're visible in a room, but nothing in that room changes because you're there. And you ain't imagining this. So that was my initial list. Now, earlier I mentioned that somewhere on this list is a form of invisibility that many people don't recognize at all. Well, that's where we are now. Before we move on, I want to actually mention 3 of them. They don't always look the way we expect invisibility to look. Here's the first one. I call this one institutional invisibility. An example of that, and I've seen this, when one's image appears in a brochure, when a Black person's image appears in a brochure, but your voice isn't welcome in the decision, in the creativity, any of that. You can be seen, but not heard, that kind of invisibility. And this happens inside organizations, leadership structures, and decision-making systems. You're visible symbolically, but not influential structurally. So the institution can claim representation while still maintaining the same power structure. The second one is called, I like to call it, narrative invisibility. When Black people are hyper-visible as problems, but invisible as full human beings. Okay, I kind of mentioned this one earlier. This lives on in the stories that society tells, in the media, public discourse, stereotypes, historical narratives. Black people, we are highly visible in certain narratives, crime, struggle, poverty, crisis, entertainment, but invisible as complex individuals, leaders, thinkers, creative people, full human beings. The problem is in the story itself, but we know what the story is based off of. And the third one, and this one really gets people here, got me too in the beginning, emotional invisibility. This is an invisibility that disguises itself as praise. For example, when someone calls you strong, all the time, oh, you're the strongest person I know. Oh, you're always so strong. Oh, you'll get through this because you're always so strong. What happens is they've stopped noticing your pain. This happens in relationships and in cultural expectations. Someone appears to be seen, even praised, but their emotional reality disappears. Very common with the strong black woman trope. The praise hides the lack of care. That's right. So, you might be thinking that invisibility means being ignored or means not being seen. But it does mean something different. There's something deeper. And those are experiences or examples of invisibility. But sometimes invisibility is more complicated. Sometimes it hides behind admiration or inside words of praise or inside stories that tell only part of the truth. Sometimes we are made hyper-visible in certain spaces as symbols and stereotypes or as so-called bad examples. And that visibility quietly covers up the places where our voices, our power, and our full humanity are missing. It covers up the other side of the story. That's why I call this invidious invisibility. So that's the complete list. And I'm sure that you recognize some of those things. I've seen them over and over again. Sometimes, most of the time, with myself, but other times just watching, just being observant. And after a while, I began to notice something. It's about myself, actually, that once I started seeing invisibility clearly, I stopped asking myself certain questions. For a long time, I wondered if the problem was me, that maybe I needed to be more confident, to speak louder, to be more prepared, more polished, more agreeable. Maybe I needed to say things differently, to dress differently, to appear differently, to present myself differently, to show up differently. But once I began to see the pattern, something else became clear. It was that this wasn't about personality or about appearance or confidence. This was about racism. Once I realized that, and once that settled in, something really did shift. Because when I thought the problem was me, I spent a lot of time trying to fix myself just to be continuously invisibilized and wondering, what did I do? But when the pattern became visible, I think we can all begin to understand that something larger is operating. And that clarity really does change how we move through the world. Naming doesn't fix everything overnight, but naming it does change how we see it and how we see the world. When something finally has a name, people can no longer pretend it isn't there. What once felt confusing begins to make sense. Moments that once felt personal begin to reveal a pattern. And once we see that pattern clearly, something else can shift inside of us. We can stop shrinking ourselves to fit into spaces that refuse to see us. We can stop questioning our worth simply because someone else refuses to recognize it. We begin to understand that invisibility was never proof that we didn't matter. It was evidence of a system that refuses to see us. And once we see it, we can't unsee it. That's right. It's like taking the red pill. Once you've taken it, you see it and you can't unsee it. And you ain't imagining this. Well, I think it may be time to wrap up. This list I think was pretty good, but it's definitely not comprehensive. I know there's so much more, and I would love to hear your input on this list and how you see yourself on this list. And what we talked about today, this pattern of invisibility, and this is an important point to me, this is not the end of the conversation. Oh no, this is just the beginning. Because once something has a name, we can finally see it clearly. And once we can see it, we can begin to ask different questions. Not, why am I invisible? Nothing like that. But what's wrong with the system? You don't ask whether you matter. You simply know that you do matter. Because the opposite of invisibilization is mattering. I've said that earlier, but it's worth repeating. And that's where this conversation is going next. So until we meet again, that's right, we're going to talk about mattering. I hope to see you here at the Umoja Café. And please keep noticing, keep naming what you see. I'm Amma Robin at the Umoja Café in YAIT Town. And remember, you ain't imagining this. One love, fam. I see you.